It is one of the most famous predators that ever lived. It prowled Ice Age America for tens of thousands of years, pulled down beasts the size of small cars, and left thousands of skulls buried in the tar of Los Angeles. And everyone knows what it was: a bigger, stronger wolf. For more than 100 years, the experts agreed. The bones said wolf. The name said wolf. Every measurement, every comparison, every careful study pointed to the same answer, and all of it was wrong. I came across the dire wolf question while reading about something else entirely, and I could not let it go. Because when scientists finally read its DNA, they did not just rename an animal. They erased a family tree that everyone assumed was there, and they quietly explained why, even now, with all of our technology, this creature can never truly come back. Picture the landscape of Ice Age America, a world of open plains and cold grassland ruled by giants. Mammoths the size of small trucks, bison heavier than any alive today. And moving through that world in coordinated packs came one of the most formidable hunters the continent ever produced. We call it the dire wolf, and for a creature that vanished so long ago, it is extraordinarily famous. Part of that fame is recent and borrowed from television, but most of it is older and earned, because we have found these animals by the thousand. At the tar pits of Los Angeles, where ancient predators were trapped in sticky asphalt while chasing trapped prey, paleontologists have pulled up the remains of more than 4,000 individual dire wolves. It is, by a wide margin, the most common large mammal recovered from that ground. We have more dire wolf skulls than we know what to do with. And that is exactly what makes the rest of this story so strange. You would think that an animal we possess in such enormous numbers would be an animal we understand completely. We do not. Because for all those thousands of skulls, there was one question the bones could not answer, and it sat at the very center of everything. What was this creature really? Look at a dire wolf skeleton beside a modern gray wolf, and the resemblance is almost uncanny. The same long snout, the same powerful jaw, the same overall shape, only built a little heavier, a little broader, a little stronger. The similarity is so close that for more than a century, scientists simply assumed the obvious. The dire wolf was a wolf. They placed it in the genus Canis, the same group that holds gray wolves, coyotes, and the domestic dog asleep at your feet. A big, brawny cousin of the animals we already knew. The case seemed closed before it was ever really opened. There was one quiet objection. Back in 1918, a paleontologist named John Campbell Merriam looked at these bones and felt something did not fit. He proposed giving the dire wolf its own separate name, its own genus, a label that set it apart from the true wolves. He called it Aenocyon, but his colleagues were not convinced. The bones looked like wolf bones, and so the animal was filed away as a wolf, and Merriam's doubt was quietly overruled. For the next 100 years, that was the settled answer. And here's the trap that caught everyone. Bones can only tell you so much. They can show you the size of a jaw and the wear on a tooth, but they cannot show you a family tree. They cannot tell you who an animal's ancestors were, or how long ago its line split from the others. To answer that, you do not need a skeleton. You need the one thing those tar pits seem to have destroyed forever. You need the genome. And no one believed it could ever be read. Before we ask who the dire wolf really was, it is worth understanding what we actually had, because the animal itself has been wrapped in myth for a very long time. Popular imagination turned it into a monster, a beast the size of a small horse, towering over everything around it. The truth is more grounded, and in some ways more interesting. A dire wolf was large, but it was not gigantic. It stood roughly 80 centimeters at the shoulder and stretched about 1.8 meters from nose to tail. A big male weighed somewhere between 60 and 70 kilograms, which is around 130 to 150 pounds. That makes it perhaps 20% heavier than the largest gray wolves alive today. Bigger, yes. Mythical, no. What set it apart was not height, it was power. Where a modern wolf is built lean and lanky for the long chase, the dire wolf was built like a wrestler. Shorter, thicker legs, broader shoulders, heavier bones carrying more muscle. This was not an animal designed to run prey down over many miles. It was an animal designed to close in, take hold, and not let go. And the most fearsome part of it sat at the front. The dire wolf carried a massive skull with broad cheekbones and a wide jaw, and the bite the jaw delivered was roughly 30% stronger than the bite of a gray wolf. Behind the canines sat specialized teeth built for shearing, capable of slicing through tough muscle and cracking into bone. This was a mouth designed to take apart something very large, and something very large is exactly what it hunted. The dire wolf rose to dominance in a world ruled by giants. The plains it crossed were home to mammoths and mastodons, to ground sloths the size of cars, to ancient bison far heavier than the bison we know, to wild horses and camels that once roamed North America in great numbers. A single one of these animals could feed an entire pack. Bringing one down was another matter. We cannot watch a dire wolf hunt, so we infer how they did it from the canids that survive. Almost certainly they hunted in packs, the way wolves do now, using numbers and coordination to isolate a single animal, surround it, and wear it down from every side. A lone predator could not wrestle a healthy bison to the ground, a dozen working as one could. That stocky, muscular body suddenly makes sense. It was the body of an animal that fought its food. We know all of this with real confidence, and that is the quiet irony sitting underneath the whole story. We can describe how the dire wolf moved, how hard it could bite, what it ate, and how it likely lived and died. The bones give us all of that freely. But the bones stop at the edge of the one question that matters most. They can tell us everything about how this animal lived, and nothing at all about where it came from. For that, we needed something the skeletons could not provide. So why did everyone get it wrong for so long? The answer is not carelessness. It is that the bones themselves were telling a lie, and they were very convincing. The resemblance between a dire wolf and a gray wolf is real. It is just not what it appears to be. In nature, there is a phenomenon that catches even careful scientists off guard. When two unrelated animals live in the same kind of world and do the same kind of job, they often end up looking the same. Same prey, same terrain, same problems to solve, and so the same solutions evolve in each of them independently. Biologists call it convergent evolution. A shark and a dolphin look alike, yet one is a fish and one is a mammal. The resemblance is not family, it is a coincidence forced by the work. That is what happened here. The dire wolf needed a long snout to grip, a heavy jaw to bite, a powerful frame to bring down large prey. So did the gray wolf. Two animals, shaped by the same harsh world into nearly the same form. And for 100 years, that shared shape was mistaken for a shared bloodline. The assumption hardened into fact. The dire wolf was the gray wolf's big cousin, a slightly bulkier branch of the same family, and almost no one thought to question it. Why would they? Everything visible agreed. There was only one way left to test it. You cannot see a family tree in a skeleton, but you can read it in DNA. The genome carries the actual record of descent, the molecular trail that shows which animals are truly related and how long ago their lines parted. Read the dire wolf's DNA, compare it to the wolf, the coyote, the jackal, the dog, and the question would finally be settled for good. There was just one problem. For decades, it could not be done. DNA is a fragile molecule. After an animal dies, it begins to break apart, and time, heat, and moisture tear it into smaller and smaller fragments until nothing usable remains. The tar pits that preserved so many dire wolf bones were, for genetics, close to the worst place imaginable. The very conditions that saved the skeletons helped destroy the DNA inside them. So, scientists faced a strange and frustrating silence. They had thousands of skulls. They could measure every one, and not a single one of them could say a word about ancestry. The most abundant Ice Age predator on the continent, an animal we held by the thousand, was also one of the most mysterious. We knew its body completely and its origins not at all. For a long time, it seemed that silence would simply never be broken, that the dire wolf would keep its secret forever, locked inside bones that had already given up everything they were willing to tell. And then the technology caught up. New methods arrived that could pull a faint genetic signal out of remains everyone had written off as hopeless. In 2021, for the first time, scientists managed to read the dire wolf's DNA, and the moment they did, the wolf story fell apart. The breakthrough came from an international team, researchers working across the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Germany. They managed to sequence 5 separate dire wolf genomes from fossils ranging between roughly 13,000 and more than 50,000 years old. It was the first time anyone had ever read the genetic code of this animal, and the results were published in the journal Nature. What they found rearranged the entire family tree. The dire wolf looked like a wolf. It lived like a wolf. It was not a wolf. The DNA showed that its lineage had split away from the line leading to modern wolves, coyotes, and dogs an unusting 5.7 million years ago. To put that in perspective, these animals had been traveling separate evolutionary roads for millions of years before they ever shared a landscape. They were not close cousins. They were barely relatives at all. Angela Perry, one of the lead researchers, put it bluntly. The dire wolf, she said, was more closely related to an African jackal than to the gray wolf standing beside it on the American plains. It may have looked, in her words, like a giant reddish coyote, an animal wearing a familiar shape over a completely foreign ancestry. And the genetics revealed something stranger still. Despite sharing the same continent for tens of thousands of years, despite living side by side with gray wolves and coyotes, the dire wolf never interbred with them. Not once that the DNA can detect. Other members of the dog family mix their bloodlines constantly. Wolves and coyotes still do it today. But the dire wolf stayed genetically alone, sealed off, exchanging nothing with the animals all around it. This is where the whole question we had been asking quietly collapses. For a century, everyone wanted to know what kind of wolf the dire wolf was. But that was never the right question. It was not a kind of wolf at all. The resemblance that fooled generations of scientists was exactly that. A resemblance, a coincidence carved by a shared way of life. The dire wolf was the last survivor of an ancient and lonely line, a branch of the dog family that had grown up entirely on its own in the New World, separate from everything we thought it belonged to. It is worth being honest about the limits here, the way good science always is. That first genome was a rough draft, assembled from damaged and fragmentary material. More recent work in 2025, drawing on fuller genetic data, has suggested the picture may be even more tangled, that the dire wolf's deep origins may involve a blend of 2 older, now vanished lines. The fine details are still being argued over, but the central finding has not moved. The dire wolf was not a wolf, and it never was. And once you understand that, something else falls into place. This was not just a discovery about where the dire wolf came from. It was the key to understanding why it died, why it disappeared so completely while its look-alike neighbors survived. The answer to its extinction was hidden in the same DNA all along. For most of its existence, the dire wolf was a success story. It dominated its world for tens of thousands of years, an apex hunter perfectly matched to the giants it preyed upon. And then, in a relatively short span of time, it was gone. To understand why, you have to understand the world it was built for and what happened when that world came apart. Around 11,700 years ago, the climate began to shift. The long ice age was ending. The cold, open grasslands and steppes that had stretched across the continent started to shrink, giving way to warmer, more crowded forests. The great herds thinned, and the megafauna, the mammoths and mastodons, and giant ground sloths and ancient bison the dire wolf depended on, began to vanish. Climate was tearing at them from one side. From the other came a new kind of hunter. Human beings had crossed into the Americas, and they hunted with weapons and coordination no animal could match, putting fresh pressure on the same large prey the dire wolf needed to survive. Squeezed from both directions, the giants collapsed. And here is where the genetics finally explains the ending. The dire wolf had spent 5.5 million years becoming one thing, a specialist built to wrestle enormous animals to the ground. Its heavy frame, its crushing jaw, its whole body was an answer to a question the world was no longer asking. When the big prey disappeared, the dire wolf was left holding a set of tools designed for a job that no longer existed. Now compare that to its neighbors. The gray wolves and coyotes living right beside it faced the very same crisis, the same vanishing prey, the same changing land. But they were flexible. They could shift to smaller, faster game, and crucially, they could interbreed, mixing their bloodlines, sharing the genetic variation that helps a population bend instead of break. They adapted. They survived. They are still here. The dire wolf could do none of that. Remember what the DNA revealed. This was an animal sealed off, a genetic island, exchanging nothing with the canids around it. The very isolation that made it unique, that ancient, separate lineage, was also a trap. It could not borrow new traits from a wider gene pool because it had no wider gene pool to borrow from. It was alone, and being alone, it had nowhere to turn when the world changed. The researchers who read its genome saw this clearly. The dire wolf was the last of an extinct line. And that fact was not just a curiosity about its past. It may have been the reason for its death. The last dire wolves are thought to have died out around 9,500 years ago. And when they went, the entire lineage went with them. This is what makes the dire wolf different from almost every other vanished animal. Most extinct creatures leave something behind, a descendant, a relative, a thread carried forward into the present. The dire wolf left nothing. The line did not narrow. It ended, which is exactly what makes the next chapter so strange. In April of 2025, a company in Texas made an announcement that traveled around the world in a matter of hours. A biotechnology firm called Colossal Biosciences revealed 3 white wolf pups, 2 males and a female, named Romulus, Remus, and Khaleesi. And the claim attached to them was extraordinary. After more than 10,000 years of extinction, the company said, the dire wolf had returned. The first de-extinction in human history. The first animal pulled back across that line that nothing had ever crossed. It is a remarkable story. It is just not quite the story the headlines told. Here is what was actually done. The scientists did not, and could not, rebuild a dire wolf from scratch. Instead, they started with the genome of a gray wolf, the living animal that superficially resembles it. Then, guided by ancient dire wolf DNA recovered from old fossils, they made a series of targeted edits, around 20 changes across 14 genes, out of the roughly 19,000 genes a wolf carries. Those edits adjusted things like body size, coat color, and build. The altered embryos were then carried by domestic dog surrogates. The pups that resulted are larger than ordinary gray wolves, with pale coats and heavier features. And this is where the scientific world divided. Beth Shapiro, the lead scientist at Colossal, defended the work with a simple argument. If an animal looks like a dire wolf and behaves like a dire wolf, she said, then she is comfortable calling it a dire wolf. But many researchers outside the company disagreed sharply. Nick Rollins, a specialist in ancient DNA, described the pups plainly as a hybrid, a gray wolf carrying a handful of dire wolf traits, not the genuine article. The paleoecologist Jacqueline Gill offered perhaps the sharpest comparison. She pointed out that her own DNA contains more than a dozen genes inherited from Neanderthals, and yet no one would call her a Neanderthal. A few edits do not make a species. And in time, even Colossal's own chief scientist acknowledged the heart of the matter, that these animals are, in truth, gray wolves with a small number of changes. Now place that beside what the DNA already told us, and the irony becomes almost unbearable. Remember the great discovery. The dire wolf was not a wolf. It split from the line of gray wolves nearly 6 million years ago, an entire lineage of its own, with no living relatives anywhere on Earth. And that single fact is precisely why it cannot truly be brought back. There is no close cousin to rebuild it from. There is no surviving branch to graft it onto. You can take a gray wolf and dress it in the dire wolf's features, give it the size and the pale coat and the heavier jaw. But underneath, it remains a gray wolf, separated from the real thing by millions of years no editing can erase. The discovery that finally told us what the dire wolf was is the same discovery that tells us it can never come home, and that brings the whole story to its quiet, unsettling end. So here's what the DNA finally revealed after 100 years of getting it wrong. The dire wolf was never the animal we thought it was. The face was a coincidence. The kinship was an illusion. Everything that made it look familiar was borrowed from a shared way of life, not inherited from a shared ancestor. And it is one of the very few great predators that left no thread behind it at all, no descendant, no surviving cousin, nothing carried forward into our world. So the animal standing behind glass in Texas wear a face the genome already explained away. They carry the look the dire wolf only ever borrowed, and none of the lineage it took 5.5 million years to become. The dire wolf did not fade into its neighbors the way so many vanished creatures do. It simply ended. And the truth about what it was arrived 10,000 years too late.